giving themselves away without design or intention. My own experience as a writer and a reader is quite different. Writing is an act of artistic and moral agency, where choices are made that the author understands, full of implications and revelations that the author also understands. One thing that we know about Dickens from his editorial work is that he had an exceptionally sophisticated understanding of how writing works, of what is appealing and why, of the balance between the artistic and the commercial, of how to create effects, and of the competing claims of morality, aesthetics, and truth in the composition and social function of serious fiction, as well as the other forms of literature that Dickens turned his attention to. We also know that Dickens was quite well aware of the impression he made upon those around him, and was adept at manipulating it. Acting was his great avocation from first to last, and he worked as hard at the presentation of his works, and of himself, as he did at his writing and editing. In addition, I will offer interpretations of almost all of Dickens's major works. One of the most interesting things about Charles Dickens is the way in which his style and his interest in social themes remained remarkably consistent throughout his career, while his vision shifted and evolved. His Christmas books, for example, offer a different philosophical solution to the dilemmas presented by capitalism than do his great novels of the 1850s, Bleak House and Little Dorrit. Dickens was intently and systematically engaged with the social and economic questions of his time. He passionately sought solutions for such practical issues as public sanitation and relief of want and ignorance. He also pondered death, evil, cruelty, innocence, comfort, pleasure, happiness, and redemption, and he was an endlessly witty man for whom words were a permanent delight. His novels shaped his life as much as his life shaped his novels, and just as his novels were in part commentary on his life, so his actions, in part, grew out of the way that writing novels gave his feelings and thoughts specific being. To a novelist, his work is not his product, but his experience. Over time, his readers are further and further removed from the details of his life, but while they are reading his books, they are in his presence, experiencing his process of thought and imagination as it precipitates inchoate idea to particular word. To me, this is the miracle of literature, that minds can communicate, can meditate upon the same images across decades, centuries, and miles. Charles Dickens was so thoroughly a novelist that we can hardly know him at all without following him into every novel. Let us, then, not approach the man himself with a hostile desire to catch him out in self-contradictions and failures of self-knowledge, but rather with a friendly desire to get to know him, and to achieve what Victorians might have termed a growing intimacy. Chapter 1. Charles Dickens was a public man and a famous man, and he assumed both of these slightly different roles in his early 20s. His first sketch, A Dinner at Poplar Walk, was published in the Monthly Magazine in December 1833. Dickens, born on February 7, 1812, was only 21, but because of his work as a parliamentary reporter, he had taught himself shorthand and was able to take down speeches word for word. He was already familiar with seeing his name in print. Nevertheless, he related later that, "I walked down to Westminster Hall and turned into it for half an hour, because my eyes were so dimmed with joy and pride that they could not bear the street, and were not fit to be seen there." Further sketches published in monthly and weekly magazines over the following months attracted considerable notice. And when sketches by Boz appeared in volume form in February and December 1836, they were well reviewed. What everyone, including Dickens himself, considered especially remarkable was their breadth of scope, and in particular the variety of lower-class characters and scenes depicted, perhaps a first in English literature. One reviewer called them a perfect picture of the morals, manners, and habits of a great portion of English society. At only 24, Dickens found himself in an advantageous authorial position. he was invited to contribute the text for a series of sporting engravings to be published by the firm of Chapman and Hall. They offered Dickens £14 per month. It is impossible to know exactly what this would be equivalent to in modern dollars, but it is useful to multiply any Dickensian sum by 35, which would make his fee about $500. The artist, Robert Seymour, was successful and famous, and it was he who was supposed to take the lead in conceiving and guiding the collaboration. The arrangement lasted 2 months, until Seymour committed suicide. In even this short a time, though, Dickens was able to assert his own resolve that he should direct the project, and by the time another artist, Hablot Browne, was hired, Dickens had gotten himself a raise, increased the proportion of the writing to the illustrations, and turned the whole endeavor into the Pickwick Papers, which was destined to become a publishing phenomenon. The Pickwick Papers was published between March 1836 and November 1837. From that time to the end of his life, Charles Dickens was a figure of whom everyone had something to say, so it is appropriate to take a look at him upon his first real entrance into the condition of celebrity. First and foremost, friends and acquaintances noted his lively presence, his charm, his good looks, and his colorful style of dress. Though rather short and even slight, Dickens was extremely straight in his bearing, and his friend and future biographer John Forster recalled the quickness, keenness, and practical power, the eager, restless, energetic outlook. Light and motion flashed from every part of it. Forster asserted that humor, habitual, unbounded, and resistless, was his most essential characteristic, but everyone he knew expressed astonishment at Dickens's level of activity, whether the object of that activity was work, games, exercise, amateur acting and play production, charitable projects, or anything else. He was good company, and he loved all sociable amusements. He later commented that at this time of his life he was going out to the theatre sometimes every night of the week, not only to see the more respectable offerings at Covent Garden and Drury Lane, but to any and all sorts of shows, spectacles, pageants, and performances. Himself adept at declaiming, singing, and performing, he was invited everywhere, and participated fully in all forms of the social life of the time, parties and at-homes, nights on the town with groups of male friends, dinners, jaunts, impromptu adventures. Already, though, observers were finding something uncanny about his manner. As astute as he was charming, he often gave people the sense that they were being scanned from top to bottom. Extant portraits and photographs certainly failed to reveal the Dickens that his contemporaries knew, especially in the early years, since for various technical reasons subjects were never pictured or photographed smiling. It is essentially important, therefore, to be mindful that what the 21st century is able to see of Dickens is the merest brittle shell of how he appeared to those around him. The Pickwick Papers sold fewer than 500 copies of the first monthly number. The fourth number sold 4,000, the 11th 14,000, and the last numbers around 40,000. Once published in volume form, it sold well for the rest of Dickens's life and after. By 1878 it had sold 1.6 million copies in various editions. The success of his literary efforts enabled Dickens to progress in his private life, and on the 2nd of April, 1836, he married Catherine Hogarth, the daughter of George Hogarth, the editor of the newly established Evening Chronicle, a journal to which Dickens contributed 20 pieces. The Hogarths were Scottish, and before becoming a journalist, George had been a lawyer in Edinburgh, and the legal adviser and intimate friend of Walter Scott, an author Dickens very much admired. Catherine was the eldest of 9 children, and the Hogarths were a lively, clever family. George himself was an accomplished musician, and served as music critic of another newspaper that Dickens had written for, the Morning Chronicle. The 24-year-old Dickens embraced the Hogarth family, and in turn was embraced by them. He was impressed with their cultural connections, their liveliness, and their talents, especially the musical ones, which Dickens had a particular affinity for, being himself a performer and ready singer of popular songs. And he treated not only George but also Mrs. Hogarth with
to keep listening to this audiobook. I've left you a link in the description so you can do it at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.